A number of fellowships, including the prestigious Fulbright Fellowship, which enabled her to do some of her research in Israel. She's published numerous articles dealing with bioethics, Jewish thought, women, all kinds of things. She made it here despite the polar vortex in the Northeast and the construction on the 405. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Michal Rasher.
Hear me? Yes. Okay, great. I never know where to stand with a microphone, and I think Dr. Ball's a little bit taller than me, so. It's wonderful to be here. I want to thank Dr. Ball and the Religious Studies Department and the whole CSUN community for having me. Number one, it's great to be able to share some of my research with you and to hear from you. It's always a wonderful thing for a teacher, for a scholar to hear from new students, because you don't need a grade from me, so I can actually hear your opinion, and you don't have to be afraid of that. Not that you should ever be afraid of sharing your opinion, but I'm not grading you. That's number one, but it's also really wonderful to be in California. As Dr. Ball said, it is freezing in New York, and it was, by the skin of my teeth we got out of there, and I feel very relaxed right now, so this should be fun. Okay, so what I'm going to do is talk about a tiny piece of my research, and I'll get to in a little bit precisely what my research was all about and what I did, and some of the larger arguments in that, I think, maybe not. But first, I want to make sure we're all on the same page, because I know not all of you are specialists in Israel or specialists in Jewish studies, and so I want to sort of give this really broad and crude and faulty general overview of Israel and Judaism and what Judaism in Israel means, so that at least we can all start from a baseline of understanding. There are going to be lots of questions that you're going to have, and there will be time to answer those questions, but I just want to, before I do that general overview, just understand this is a terrible general overview, because we can't possibly give a general overview of an entire country and entire religion, right, in 10 minutes. But we're going to try, and then we're going to get to this particular topic of abortion in Israel and the areas of ethics, religion, and economics. So that's the overview for the day. Everybody feel okay with that?
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right. So what this talk is really going to do is break down what we mean by ethics, right? I teach ethics, I teach religious ethics, and there's a sort of assumption that we can find the Jewish position on abortion, right? Or the Catholic position on end-of-life issues, right? Or insert religion, insert ethical problem, and we can sort of find within scripture or some sort of religious authority an answer to what do we do when faced with this problem, right? Or what should we do when faced with this problem? Now, my research question started off like this. That's all baloney. It started off with the assumption that actual people don't really concern themselves. They may know what their religious traditions say about a particular issue, but when it comes to making these complicated decisions, like abortion, a decision that's very intimate and very complicated, right? They may not be turning to, in fact, my argument is they're likely not turning to their religious authorities or their religious traditions in a sort of dogmatic way that religious ethics tends to present itself, okay? That they are balancing a variety of issues that they need to negotiate, right? Whether it's family needs or their financial situation or their own imaginings for their life trajectory, and that all of these issues actually play a very big part in what we mean by ethics. So part of what I want to do is take this research and say, let's really revise how we think about ethics so that it more accurately reflects how people are actually making ethical decisions. So that's the sort of the background here. Okay, so this rough overview of Israel starts like this. Israel has a very long history. This is just the establishment of Israel as a Jewish state in 1948. we can not get into the politics because it's too political and too complicated right now and beyond the scope here, but as a Jewish state, Israel was established in 1948. These are contemporary maps of Israel. The one on the right shows Israel with the neighboring countries. Israel is actually technically in Asia, even though it's surrounded by these countries, and we refer to that area as the Middle East, right? It's technically in Asia, and Israel is that tiny yellow, bright yellow spot in the middle with the border on the Mediterranean Sea, and then bordered by all these other countries, Egypt and Jordan and Syria and Lebanon, okay? And then on the left is your, zoomed in image of Israel. You'll see a lot of things on these maps that hopefully you've heard about in the news if you're sort of, pay attention to these issues. I know they can get a little overwhelming. But what you'll see is, number one, areas of land and areas of water, right? You'll see there aren't, I'll skip that statement, but you'll see, and then, so there's this yellow spot, right? And then there is this like purpley gray area, okay? There are two purpley gray areas. The bigger one is what's called the West Bank, and then the smaller one is Gaza, okay? And Israel, the reason why I say these are contemporary maps is because in the, 60 plus years of existence as a Jewish state, Israel has gone through many manifestations of maps. Basically, different land has belonged to Israel and not belonged to Israel. Different land has traded hands and been won in wars and lost. And so that's why these are contemporary maps, just to give you sort of what we're talking about here. And again, we can get into what the West Bank and Gaza really are maybe later if there's time. But I'm going to try to avoid those questions because they're just beyond the scope here. Not that they're not important and ethical, but they are beyond the scope. Okay. So what do I mean when I say that Israel is a Jewish state? Israel is a Jewish and democratic state. That's how they were established in 1948. And what that means is that in order to remain both Jewish and democratic, they have to maintain a Jewish majority in the population. Okay? That's why some of these issues of reproduction are going to become very important. And so keep that in mind as we go on in the talk, okay? So it's got a Jewish majority. 73% of the population is Jewish currently. It also means that these Jewish symbols are going to dominate the sort of the government presentation. So this is a picture of the Israeli flag up on the top, right, with the Star of David in the middle. And then on the bottom is the emblem of Israel, which has a menorah, a seven-branched candelabra. Okay? Hebrew is one of the national languages in Israel. Arabic is also. Judaism also functions as a sort of national religion in Israel. So what that means is that for Jews, the rabbinate, there are official religious bodies that control personal affairs, marriage, the procedures of marriage, the procedures of divorce, death, all these things that come under sort of personal areas. They're controlled by a group of rabbis in Israel, if you're Jewish, right? The national anthem speaks of the Jewish dream of a homeland. These are ways that Judaism manifests itself in Israel in an official capacity. And Jewish holidays are celebrated nationally. So on the buses, you probably never even noticed that your bus, if you ride a bus, anybody ride a bus here? You guys ride buses in this area? Yes? Okay, so if you ride a public bus, right, usually the marquee at the top just has like the bus number and the direction that it's going, right, or the end goal, right? So in Israel, around certain holidays, it'll say a holiday message in addition to, the Jewish holiday message in addition to, so it'll say like Hanukkah Sameach, right, which means Happy Hanukkah, right, or Happy New Year around the New Year time. So these are ways in which Judaism sort of permeates, various cultural parts of Israeli society. What else can I say? I think that's, any immediate questions about that so far? Okay, write it down if it comes up. We can get to it. Okay, now, what is Judaism, right? I understand there are some people here who are in a Judaism class, right? Raise your hand. Okay, great, wonderful. So, again, this terribly crude, broad overview of Judaism. Judaism has gone through many changes over its long history. There is no way to speak of one Judaism, right? But over the last century and a half, we've seen this sort of severe fracturing within Judaism between three main branches. There are a few other branches. These are the three main branches, Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform, each delineating a separate commitment to what we can call tradition versus modernity. Again, a sort of very crude dichotomy there, but that's sort of the underlying tension in each of these changes that's gone on. So the pictures that I'm sharing are mostly highlighting the sort of gender aspects of these changes, okay? So Orthodox Judaism up at the top maintains a very strict division between men and women. So this is a picture of women dancing at a wedding, right? You can see the bride in the middle, and you'll see that only women are around her. And generally at Orthodox weddings, men and women are not dancing together, right? They're dancing separately. At some Orthodox weddings, they don't even eat together. So that's how you see the sort of separation that maintains, and men have their own responsibilities within the tradition and their own obligations, and women have their own. Okay? The conservative movement has created their own particular balance between tradition and modernity, maintaining aspects of tradition, right? That are, very strong, but allowing for gender egalitarianism. So that's why you see women pursuing those, things that within Orthodox Judaism are really only for men. And then the Reform movement has rejected a great deal of rabbinic commentary in favor of a different sort of interpretation, and gone even further in their sort of gender accommodations by, see this title here, God's No He-Man in the Reform Judaism prayer book, meaning they've even gone so far as to change the liturgy so that it reflects a certain gender neutrality or egalitarianism or things like that. So that's our sort of broad overview. Okay, questions? All right, most of this isn't even relevant for the talk, but I wanted you all to be able to walk away and say, I know a little bit about a lot of things. So I think that's a good thing to walk away with. Okay, great. Let's keep going. All right. So my research focused on Haredi Jews. Haredi are ultra-Orthodox Jews. Okay? It's a term that refers to a whole host of different even sections within ultra-Orthodox Judaism. So there are, it can be said there are about as many differences among Haredi Jews as there are between Haredi Jews and other Jews. In that, really, so you'll see, if you're a really close observer, you'll see here that the men and the women each have slightly different garb in each of the pictures, right? So this big furry hat on the top right hand corner indicates one particular connection to one sect within Haredi Judaism, okay? And then the one on the left, see that guy's wearing a sort of a more flat sort of boring hat, let's say, okay? And he's from a different sect within Haredi Judaism, and they each have their own commitments and their own particular traditions and things like this, but we can refer to them all sort of broadly within Haredi Judaism. So my work was with Haredi women, and you see a few pictures of Haredi women. It is actually increasingly difficult to find pictures of Haredi women that don't include baby strollers. And we'll get to exactly why I really wanted to find a picture of a woman not with a baby stroller, but it's very difficult, and so it's fine, it sort of makes the point. But so my research was with Haredi women. I did research for 2 years in Jerusalem. I did ethnographic research. Anybody know what ethnographic research is? What that means? Yeah.
You want to go with the people you're studying?
Okay, so one version is to live with them. I didn't choose to live with them for a few reasons, but yeah, you live with them. Some live with them, but what do you do when you're living with them? What's the sort of point of living with them?
You understand the tradition from within?
Yeah, exactly. So the point is to sort of understand the tradition as an insider would understand it. Okay, great. And so one of the things that I did extensive interviews with Haredi women. So I interviewed 25 women who had had at least 3 children. And I interviewed them each 2 or 3 times for about 2 or 3 hours each for each interview. And I got a sense of, many of them were much longer because we sort of spent entire days together, and I was able to see their entire routine and how they interacted with their children and their husbands and their friends and all of these things. And the other thing that's part of, so we talk about interviews and what's called participant observation, right? Which is the combination of 2 actually different acts, right? One is participating and one is observing. So I'd go to sort of group meetings that they had or informal classes that they held together and sit there and observe and participate if they asked me to participate, but you have to play this very fine line, right? Between not wanting to sort of influence the situation so much that it's different from if you were just literally a fly on the wall, right? But you're there. You can't sort of ignore the fact that you're there, and they're not ignoring the fact that you're there. So that's some of the things that I did. So I interviewed Haredi women. I also, for the purpose of my research, interviewed a number of doctors, a number of nurses, social workers, and doulas. Anybody know what a doula is? Yeah, what's a doula?
She helps you through the pregnancy.
Yeah, she helps you through the pregnancy and the labor. There are people who are trained. In Israel, you have midwives actually delivering babies. So I interviewed some midwives, and then doulas are sort of not official hospital employees. People hire them separately to help them through the labor and delivery. Okay. Okay. One of the critical things to understand about Haredi Judaism as it is today is that there is a very immediate relationship between one's rabbi and oneself. So the idea is that whenever you might have a question, right, and it could be something as benign as, what's a benign question? Problem is, once you go to your rabbi with a question, it's no longer benign. But, I don't know, think of a benign question. Which toothbrush should I buy? Actually, that's a good example. Which toothbrush should I buy, right? To, should I take up this business venture that would take me away from Jerusalem, right? My research was centered in Jerusalem. So, that's a big question, right? Or, should we have more children? That's a pretty major question, right? You would take all of these questions to your rabbi. That's a sort of phenomenon within Haredi Judaism today. And it's really an extreme of any sort of manifestation of Haredi Judaism. It's, and the point, right, the rabbis like this. Why, if you're a rabbi, why would you like this? I'm sorry, who said it? And what? Power. Power and control, right? You get to decide which toothbrush everybody buys. Right? Okay, but then what does that mean? When I keep playing that out, let's say you always recommend the Colgate toothbrush. Soon enough, Colgate's going to come knocking on your door and say, hey, why don't you keep recommending Colgate? And, we'll share the wealth a little bit. Okay? Don't fool yourself. This absolutely happens. Not with toothbrushes, but with medical procedures, which is even scarier, right? Okay, another aspect that if you want to get there, we can get there. Okay. Now, one of the important things to understand about Haredi Jews in Israel is that there's a great amount of tension between this group of Jews, which populate about 10 to 20% of the population, right, and the state itself, okay? And some of this is very historical. So the current situation, I'm sharing you images of protests now about the debate that's currently going on in Israel over whether or not Haredi Jews should be enlisted into the army, okay? Now in Israel, for Jews in the state, there's a mandatory enlistment at the age of 18, right? So you guys are all above the age of 18, right? So you'd all be in the army if you were Jewish in Israel, right now. You'd go straight to the army after high school, and then you'd go on to college or vocation or whatever you wanted to do after that. Haredim from the establishment of the state, were able to work out a deal where they said with the prime minister, you know what, for us, it's more important for us to be learning, right? We do Torah study, we do Jewish study in what's called a yeshiva, that's a school primarily for boys, right? And we do this from the age of 6 until we die, basically. And we can't possibly take a break to go into the army, right? And we need to continue doing this. We don't want to enlist. And the prime minister at the time thought that the Haredi Jews were going to really die out very soon because this way of life was not possibly sustainable. And so said, okay, fine. So, fine. So as long as you're in yeshiva, you don't have to go to the army. The problem is, not the problem, the sort of trick is, though, that Haredi Jews actually continue to multiply at a very fast rate, and so this tradition has become just sort of the status quo, and you have this humongous population of the Jewish community in Israel that doesn't go into the army. This creates a whole host of problems for them in Israel. Number one, that's where you make connections about jobs. If you haven't served in the army and people see that on your resume, it becomes very difficult to get a job, and this plays out for non-Jewish populations in Israel also. So it means that the Haredi Jews are really maintained in this lifestyle indefinitely. And the state supports this by giving them stipends to remain by giving them money, monthly stipends to remain in yeshiva, because they've made the argument, the Haredim have made the argument that our learning of Torah is just as important as your protection of the army. Okay, so these are protests that are going on now about this debate. That the one in the top right-hand corner actually says, only in Israel is learning Torah considered a felony, right? The sort of irony of the statement is what they're supposed to be getting at. Okay. The other thing to keep in mind about Israel, about Haredim, is that they have a lot of babies and they live in total poverty. So they average about 6 to 8 children per family. A number of the women I interviewed had, 13, 18, 21 children, and they live in really total poverty. Most of the poor population in Israel, these statistics are very recently, come from either the Haredi population or the Arab population. 50% of the Haredi population lives below the poverty line, and Haredi families make about half as much as secular families. So you can sort of see how this lifestyle has become difficult, right? Difficult from the state's perspective because they're supporting them, and difficult from their own perspective to maintain these large families without a very large income. So that's what we're dealing with. Okay, now we can actually get to the topic of the talk. Wasn't that fun? Okay, great. You'll excuse me if we I think we're gonna have to cut some stuff. That's okay. All right. Okay. So we're talking about abortion in Israel. Here's the legislation. Before 1977, the official law in Israel was that abortion is totally illegal, right? This was part of the British mandate. Israel didn't sort of get behind itself and create laws for everything. A lot in 1948, they're sort of playing catch up. So this law is left over from the British mandate, which said that, right, if you perform an abortion as a physician, you could go to jail for 14 years. If a woman procures an abortion, she could go to jail for 5 years. This was rarely ever, right, prosecuted, or actually nobody was ever caught, right, doing this. One of the reasons that they actually went back and created the law was because they actually put someone on trial, and they said, this is insane, we can't actually be put, right, this is the 1970s, okay, and I'll ask you in a second to think about America 1970s, right, we can't actually put somebody on trial for performing an abortion, so let's rethink this. So the committee put together 5 recommendations for when abortion would be allowed. So the law says abortion is illegal except in these 5 circumstances. So what are these 5 circumstances? 1, a woman's physical or emotional health is in danger. That is intentionally vague. 2, pregnancy endangers her life. 3, pregnancy is a result of rape or incest. 4, there is a fear for the fetus's mental or physical health, also vague, intentionally. And 5, there's a possibility of disrupting a woman's life or her family. Now, this law allows for abortion even at this time, allowed for abortion until 39 weeks gestation, which is a full-term pregnancy, okay? And it allows, and what it requires, though, is that in order to make sure you're meeting one of these 5 criteria, you have to go through a committee at a hospital. And over the last 40 years, there have been, many more committees than there were in the 1970s. But even in the 1970s, there was one in every major city. And you had to go through a committee and give your reason, and they would approve or disapprove. But even from the 1970s, the approval rate was about 96 to 99%, depending on the year, which meant a lot of people have said it was basically a rubber stamp. Now we can talk, actually I'm curious to know whether you think those committees are still, even though they're a rubber stamp, somewhat problematic, right? So anyway, so pause for a second. How does this law, right, and this is basically, right, I'm gonna highlight the piece that changes, but this is basically the law as it's accepted from the 1970s until today. So how does this compare to the law that we had in the 1970s and maybe what we had today regarding abortion? Would you say it's more liberal, more lenient, or less so? Does this make it more difficult for a woman to get abortion or easier? More difficult, you think. Why is it more difficult?
Because I think there's a certain process that you have to go through, and it's also based on another individual's opinion to decide if the child in her womb is either mentally ill or is it dangerous to her life. Because sometimes you may not know if it's dangerous until she actually gives birth.
Okay.
Which is in that process.
True. Okay, so you're saying, really, you're answering that other question, which is, even though the committees approve a high number, the fact that you require a committee to approve it makes it a more difficult situation. Okay, great. Anybody disagree? Yeah, what do you think?
I think it's pretty much very similar. I mean, number 5 gives anybody the option to get an abortion, disrupting a woman's life or her family's life. But then there is obviously the inconvenience of going through a committee once again.
Okay, so that 5th clause, now I should say this only, so you may or may not know, Israel has had basically universal health care coverage for a very long time. And this law, if you meet these criteria, allows for the healthcare coverage to pay for your abortion. If you want to pay for it out of pocket, right, at this time in the 1970s, it cost about $250. Now it costs, I think, about $1,500 or $2,000, which is a significant amount of money. But you could go through the procedure and get it paid for by the state. Okay, let's focus on that 5th clause, because the debate, right? You might think that the debate in the Knesset, right, the Israeli parliament, was primarily about the ethics of abortion in general, but it wasn't, right? The debate, even from the religious parties, right, the Orthodox Jewish parties, was about this 5th clause. Whether the 5th clause really reflected the sort of ethical arrangement we wanted to have in Israel. There was no question, basically no question, that abortion needed to be something that we made accessible, that Israel made accessible to women. There was question over this last clause. So why? Because this last clause was understood to refer to which population of women?
Reddick.
The Haredi women, right? Because these are the women it mentions specifically, as in the case of women with large families. So the question was, are we going to create a situation where women with large families are given particular exception to have abortions, and what that means for us as we're creating an ethic of abortion in Israel? So that's the question. Okay, so what I'm going to present you with is a couple of positions, pro and con, this 5th clause, and then we'll discuss, and maybe in the questions I'll get to what the contemporary situation looks like and whatnot, but we can focus on this. Okay. All right, so pro 5th clause, which means we're in favor of keeping the 5th clause in the abortion law. This is from one member of Knesset. MK stands for member of Knesset, Knesset being the Israeli parliament. And Shmaoni says in 1975, there is large doubt if the birth of children that are not wanted by their families are wanted by society. See what that implication is, right? That these children, these high-order children, are actually not wanted by their families. That's what he's saying. Families with many children are blessed by their many children if the parents have the financial and emotional ability to raise them and educate them. Okay? And he's playing on this language as a reference to the way Haredi families are euphemistically referred to in Israel as families blessed with children. It's euphemistic because secular society that refers to these families as families blessed with children actually doesn't think that this number is a good thing. So that's why it's used, sort of ironically. And he's doing the same thing. He's saying these families can't possibly afford to pay for these children, therefore we should allow these women to get abortions if they want abortions. Okay. Here's the opposing argument. In 1977, member of Knesset Abu Chatzira says, the fifth clause ruins the entire law. The fifth clause reveals the impure intentions. This clause comes to harm families with many children who maybe are not comfortable to certain people, right? Referring specifically to the sort of cultural tension between secular and Haredi families in Israel. They're not comfortable to certain people. It comes to harm those families that live in certain neighborhoods, right? Haredi families, in order to get the social services that they need, live in certain neighborhoods. And more serious than this, you are using this clause to say to these families, stop having children because we're not capable of solving all of your problems. So Abu Chatzira felt, right, that the fifth clause was really problematic because it sent out a response to these families, which was, we don't want you to have any more children. We can't take care of them, and you can't take care of them. And that's a terrible thing, Abu Chatzira says, for us to say. That's a terrible ethic, right? Instead, right, we should be supporting them, he goes on to say. Okay. Now we have the fact that, remember I mentioned that in order to remain a Jewish and a democratic state, Israel has to maintain a majority of Jews in the population. So Haredi families, right, with a birth rate of 6 to 8 children, help to maintain that majority, right? And so a number of members of Knesset expressed a great deal of concern whether allowing these women to have abortions would actually lower their birth rate, thus threatening the Jewish majority in the state. So that's where these demographic concerns come in, okay? So Perush in 1975 says, why does this country invest millions in aliyah, referring to immigration, and why not invest in helping the mother and not make a law with a painful clause like this that kills fetuses because of economic conditions? So he's opposed to this fifth clause, right, because it doesn't support the family. And he continues to say the law contradicts the fundamentals of Torah, the Torah, the culture of non-Jews, the foundation and national interests of the people of Israel, the basic interests on which we established the country, and, right, this is the important part, our position in the bitter contest with the Arabs in our national growth. The demographic contest, right, was always as opposed to the growth of the Arabs in Israel. And that's where that tension came in, right? That's where the concern was the Haredim are the only ones reproducing at a rate that will allow Israel to compete with the Arabs in their repopulation, okay? And that was the concern. Okay. Then Namir gives us a bit of a sort of feminist twist, right? Namir is one of the founders of the feminist movement in Israel. And she's actually saying we should keep this fifth clause because already many women are found in a situation of constant pregnancy. Women who at the age of 27, 28, 29 are mothers to 8, 9, or 10 children. These women are exhausted, sad, have no energy and no money, and are sick. The responsibility to care for them, the children, and educate them falls on their shoulders, meaning the women's shoulders. Okay? So she's giving us a sort of feminist ethic, which is to say we need to give the women more options for having abortion, right? Just having a lot of children should be enough of a reason, she says. But then she continues, and here we get to some of her real concerns. What is not good for the person, and the woman mother is also a person, and what is not good for the family will not be good for the army and won't be good for the nation, right? So her real concern is how are we helping to strengthen the nation, right? And there is a financial undertone, an economic undertone to this concern, which is to say the country can't possibly support these families, right? We can't give out the kind of welfare that they need in order to support these very large families. So we need to make it possible, right? And perhaps encourage them to go through with abortions. You didn't hear that from me. Okay. Okay, so what do you think happened? Who won? Which side won? Did they keep the 5th clause or did they get rid of it? I'll go back to the 5th clause just so everybody knows. All right. What do you think? How many people think they kept the 5th clause? Okay, how many people think they got rid of it? Not everybody raise your hand. Take a guess. All right. So in 1977, the law passed with the 5th clause in it. It was a big success. So those of you who said they kept the clause, you're right. The problem is you were wrong in 1979 when the religious parties were needed to form a coalition in the government, and the religious parties said, you can pass the whole law, we're totally fine with abortion, but not with the 5th clause. And why specifically? Because it refers to, it's intended to help Haredi women have abortions. So in 1979, they got rid of the 5th clause, and this is essentially how the law exists today, except for one major change that has happened in the last, 2 months, okay? Which is, the other manifestation of the law was that if you were under 17 or over 40, you could get an abortion without any question. Okay, this was another thing that went into the final proposal in 1979. Okay, but now, if you're between the ages of 20 and 33, you can get an abortion without a question, for no other reason other than to show your driver's license. Okay, so I should really have a slide with a contemporary law in it. I don't. I apologize because now it's very confusing. But so that's sort of how the law looks today. Anecdotally, I can tell you that the committees that most women go in, as in America, most abortions happen in the first trimester, right? Which means most of this other stuff isn't even known except for the results of, right, whether it's a result of rape or incest, right? We don't really know about the fetus's health or, unless you have a previous medical history with pregnancy, you may not know if it endangers your life yet, right? But in the first trimester indicates that there are most of the reasons for abortion are falling within that 5th clause. And between 1977 and 1979, when that 5th clause fell out, there was no change in the reasons, in the number of abortions and the reasons women gave for abortion, which means that the 5th clause ended up getting subsumed into all the others. So that's where we'll end for now, but let me take some questions. We have about 15 minutes, and I want to hear from you guys. Yes, we have an eager question.
So you said that this group is very Orthodox, right? So they're Orthodox Jews. Now, if they turn to their rabbi for everything, then would the rabbi let them go through with abortion?
That is a great question. Thank you for asking it. Okay. So I'm going to answer it in a number of ways. Okay. One is that, remember I talked about the gender separation between men and women in Orthodox Judaism? So in ultra-Orthodox Judaism, it's even more severe. There are times of the year when men and women don't walk on the same streets because it's like considered holy time. And all rabbis are men or women? What do you think? Men. Good. Okay, all rabbis are men in Orthodox Judaism. So a woman doesn't actually approach her rabbi directly with a question, right? So what does that require? It requires that she's actually communicating to her husband well enough, right? And wanting to engage in a conversation about abortion with her husband, which for other reasons is really difficult to have, right? And then her husband's gonna bring the question to her rabbi. Short answer is these questions don't get to the rabbis, except that questions of birth control get to the rabbis, okay? And rabbis now in Haredi Judaism will approve of birth control for a whole host of reasons. You go and you say, I've had a couple of kids, meaning one or two, and I'm really tired, or I need a break, or, you know, I had really terrible postpartum depression and I need to get that treated before I have another, blah, blah, blah. And most rabbis, with some complications, will say, absolutely, take a break, 6 months, a year, come back to me, we'll talk, we'll figure it out. I'm whitewashing a whole lot of ethical problems there, but, you know, anyway. If you go to your rabbi and you say, I want to go on birth control because we don't have the money to support a child right now. We just got married, we're 20 years old, right? I didn't even talk about ages of marriage or anything like that, but we're 20 years old, we just got married, I don't have a job, my husband learns all day, he gets this really modest stipend, we don't have money. Guess what he says? No. Money is not a sufficient, I didn't even leave you time to guess, but money is not a sufficient reason to go on birth control to avoid childbearing, child rearing. It's just considered not a good reason within this group. So women may go with a whole host of other reasons, right? In other words, lying, okay? But that's how they can get around it. So if you were to go to your rabbi and say, I need an abortion because we can't afford a child, he'd say, no. It's possible, though, that if you go to your rabbi and you say, I need an abortion because we already have 7 children, I know this one is going to have so-and-so problems, and we can't afford, and we can't deal with that, right? There are sort of allowances made. Well, that's a great question. Did I answer it sufficiently? Did I answer it too much?
No.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes,
Is there Haredi representation in the Knesset?
there is. Yes, yes, yes.
And did they have a position on the 5th clause?
So they were sort of spearheading abolishing the 5th clause because, and this was the sort of big misunderstanding, the 5th clause was actually put in there for a different population of Jews in Israel that in the 1970s were advocating for this clause because they felt like, and these are Jews from what we refer to as Sephardi and Mizrahi countries, North Africa, Spain, these types of countries. These were Jews who had immigrated and had never been able to climb the social ladder because they lived in such poverty. And representatives of these Jews actually went to the committee and said, we need a way to encourage, to allow women in our community to have abortion because we don't have access to anything else, right? So that's what the clause was really intended to help, right? The Haredi parties took this as a personal offense to them. And it became a sort of culture war debate in Knesset. What else? Yeah.
What about prenatal testing? Do you find that Haredi women go for prenatal testing that might lead them to have an abortion if there's a defect?
It depends on what kind of testing you're talking about. Genetic testing, now there is a big organization in Israel that actually, before you're sort of set up on a date, right, you don't actually go out and date whoever you want, you're set up by a matchmaker in this community. And before you even are set up by the matchmaker, you go through extensive prenatal genetic testing in high school. And the matchmaker calls and says, this organization says, I want to set up numbers 3, 2, 4 with numbers 8, 9, 10, right? Are they a good match? And the company will either say, yes, they're totally fine, they won't produce any babies with any genetic problems, right? Or, no, they're a terrible match, you cannot pursue this. So nobody knows what the genetic defect is, but that's how they avoid the growth of these genetic diseases, which are very prominent in certain areas of the Jewish community. In terms of prenatal testing about gestational things that might arise, right, problems that might arise during the pregnancy that aren't genetic, they do, certain sects within Haredi Judaism will allow for ultrasounds. Certain sects won't. In my research with Haredi women, I basically discovered that women do whatever they want when it comes to ultrasounds because most women felt like the ultrasound was the only way they knew that everything was okay with the baby. And so they said, I know my rabbi doesn't approve of ultrasounds, but, and this is a direct quote, he's never been pregnant. I've been pregnant, right? And I heard this from a number of women 3, 4, 5, 10 times. I know what's going to make me calm and make sure that I continue this pregnancy in a relaxed and responsible manner, and therefore I'm going to get an ultrasound. The other thing that's unavoidable for these women is that, and this is actually where this project at one point started, right, was the fact that in Israel, you get an abortion basically with every doctor visit. So it could be, you get an ultrasound, sorry. Excuse me, talking too much, time to take a break. Okay, you get an ultrasound with every doctor visit. So 12, 13, 14 ultrasounds. In America, you may get 3, 4, 2, right, depending on how high risk your pregnancy is, but you won't get a dozen. So this sort of ubiquity of ultrasounds just makes it sort of impossible to avoid.
What about amniocentesis?
They'll only, so Israel, right, you may know, is medically sophisticated, and so they'll only do amniocentesis if there's real indication in the ultrasound to do it. Yeah. Yeah.
Is the gender of the fetus ever considered for abortion?
Great question, and it's one I generally get when you find in the Haredi community what may seem like a preference for males, and the answer is no. It's just not. I mean, I can tell you that a number of women had stories for me, you know, of they may not find out, they won't find out the sex of the baby before it's born, but at the birth, you know, a father may be a little more disappointed to have a baby girl than a baby boy, but it would be no reason to abort the baby. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Does the Haredi community follow the Talmud, and what does the Talmud say about the abortion?
Great, really great question. The Talmud says a lot of things about abortion. Right, as you probably know, the Talmud is a collection of rabbinic commentary on the Mishnah, right, on the sort of codification of laws. And Talmud codified about 700 CE, so pretty old document, right? And it's very rich in terms of its collection. The Talmud actually does talk about fetuses in their own sort of, in the rabbi's own sort of limited scientific knowledge. They think that things that you see on the outside world might actually affect what your fetus looks like. So, you know, they talk about sort of don't look at anything that's sort of crude or immodest, because your fetus might come out looking like a fish or a sandal. They actually talk about like your fetus might, like your baby might look like a shoe, which is just bizarre. But, you know, these are sort of ruminations of what happens in fetal development, which is pretty interesting. If you want, the other funny thing about Judaism, right, as with most religions, that you can find contradictory positions on anything. So if you want support for abortion, there's a whole discussion on support for abortion. If you want to oppose abortion, you could find sources within Jewish law to oppose abortion. So the Talmud says both. Sorry, that's a terrible answer. It says both. Any other questions?
I have one.
Okay. I'll take a student, and then I'll take, yeah.
Okay, so I had a question because you said you found it really difficult to find women, Haredi women without strollers.
Pictures on Google Images, yeah.
Why is it so? Is it because women usually tend to be with their men, or is it because they're home raising the children? Or
Oh no, I'm sorry, maybe I said it incorrectly. I would like to find a picture of a Haredi woman without a baby stroller. And what I'm saying is all the pictures on Google Images are Haredi women with babies.
Is that like a stereotype
Yeah.
they have on them?
Yeah, basically, right? And the irony, of course, this I didn't say, right, is that because Haredi men are learning in yeshiva all day, women are actually the ones working. So if they want to make more than the very modest stipend that they get from the government, and a stipend that that they also get for their children, right, they need to work outside the home. So Haredi women work in jobs, all over various sectors in Israel. So that's the sort of irony of the whole situation, right? That these are women who actually do have careers outside of raising babies, and yet it's very difficult to find pictures of them doing anything except for raising babies, precisely because of the stereotype. Yeah, good question. Yeah.
My question goes back to the rabbinic control over people's lives. Do the rabbis' wives sort of intercede in these conversations that maybe the woman cannot have with her husband or the rabbi, but she can talk to the rabbi's wife and somehow make something
Good
happen?
question. So some rabbis' wives are helpful. Some are very helpful, and they'll say to a woman, right? Another number of women said to me, "Oh, don't tell my husband that you asked me this question," or "Don't tell my husband that you," or "Make sure nobody finds out that you've asked this question. If it gets back to my husband, you'll be in big trouble." Okay. Others, though, become just sort of extensions of their husbands. So one woman I spoke to was very afraid because her rabbi's wife saw her coming out of the doctor's office with ultrasound images, right? You can get like a printout. She was very afraid because she knows her rabbi is opposed to ultrasound images, and she stuffed them in her purse as soon as she saw the rabbi's wife. And she was very nervous. She said that we happened to speak sort of right after this happened, and she was sort of shaking because she was terrified that her rabbi's wife had seen her with these images, and there would be repercussions. And the repercussions are sort of, some of them are sort of social stigma, right? In other words, you're not being as strict as you need to be, right? And some of them could be actual repercussions for the family, right? Like her husband may be kicked out of the yeshiva, or her kids may be kicked out of a school because they're understood now to be not as Haredi as they need to be. So these are really serious chances that women are taking when they do something against the rabbis, but right, they're making these decisions on a variety of factors having nothing to do with what their rabbis think.
So it's not like the rabbi's wife is somebody you can really trust?
Not always. It depends on the rabbi's
In many
wife.
cases.
Right. I'll take this last question in the back, I think, because then I want to respect everybody's
I'm
time.
just curious, if the Haredi women are having on average 7 to 8 children, and they're the ones who think because their husbands are studying, who's taking care of the children while they're working?
There are extensive nurseries within the community. And Israel is very liberal in terms of maternity leave, maintaining your job after like a 6 or 12-month maternity leave. So that sort of helps them, but there are nurseries, and also they live very close to their mothers, right, or their mothers-in-law, who are sometimes still raising children themselves. And the other interesting dynamic is sometimes their older kids are taking care of the younger babies. Okay, thank you very much. You had a great